A hunter is unexpectedly led through the forest by a young bear cub. When they arrive at a hidden spot, the hunter is confronted by a revelation that makes him question his own life choices. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning fog clung to the forest floor as Tom adjusted his rifle strap, his boots crunching against fallen leaves. 20 years of hunting had taught him to move silently, but today something felt different. The usual thrill of the hunt was missing, replaced by a hollow feeling he couldn't shake. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. A true hunter knows the forest like his own home. Tom had spent countless hours learning every trail, every animal track, and every bird call, just as his grandfather had taught him. But lately, these lessons felt more like burdens than wisdom. The forest was alive with morning activity. Chickadees called from the branches above, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed against a hollow tree. The earth smelled rich and damp from last night's rain, bringing memories of childhood adventures when the forest seemed more magical than dangerous. Tom paused to check his compass, though he hardly needed it anymore. The old hunting grounds had changed over the years. Logging had thinned out some areas, while others had grown denser. He remembered when this particular section was just saplings. Now the trees towered overhead, their canopy casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. A twig snapped somewhere ahead. Tom froze, his muscles tensing with practiced precision. Through the understory, he caught a glimpse of movement, the distinctive shape of a deer's head bobbing between the trees. His hands moved automatically to position his rifle, decades of muscle memory taking over. The deer was a prime target, standing broadside about 60 yards away. Tom's finger rested lightly on the trigger, his breathing steady and controlled. Just as he was about to squeeze, a flash of brown fur in his peripheral vision made him hesitate. At first, he thought it might be another deer, but the movement was different, more playful, less cautious. Tom slowly turned his head, keeping the rifle trained on his original target. There, tumbling through a patch of ferns, was a bear cub. The small bear, no larger than a medium-sized dog, seemed completely oblivious to Tom's presence. It was focused entirely on chasing a butterfly, batting at it with clumsy paws and rolling through the underbrush. Tom's hunter instinct screamed at him to scan for the mother bear. Cubs never traveled alone, but something about this one seemed different. The cub paused its play and looked directly at Tom. Instead of showing fear or aggression, it tilted its head curiously. Its eyes held an intelligence that made Tom lower his rifle slightly. The deer forgotten, Tom watched as the cub took a tentative step toward him. Every lesson about bear safety told him to back away slowly, to make himself large and intimidating. But the cub's behavior defied everything Tom knew about wild animals. It moved with a deliberate grace that seemed almost human. The cub sat back on its haunches, regarding Tom with what could only be described as amusement. It made a soft, chuffing sound, almost like a laugh, and Tom found himself chuckling in response. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a seasoned hunter, having a moment of connection with what should have been either a threat or prey. Time seemed to slow as Tom watched the cub. The morning light filtered through the canopy, creating a spotlight effect around the small bear. In that moment, Tom felt something shift inside him, a subtle but undeniable change in how he viewed the forest and his place in it. The cub stood again, shook itself, and took another step toward Tom. This time, it made a gentle grunting sound and looked over its shoulder, as if inviting him to follow. Tom's rational mind told him this was crazy, dangerous even, but something deeper, something that resonated with those childhood memories of a magical forest, urged him to take a step forward. As he moved, the cub's eyes seemed to sparkle with approval. Tom would later swear he saw the hint of a smile on its face. The little bear turned and started down a barely visible trail, pausing every few steps to ensure Tom was following. The deer had long since vanished, But Tom no longer cared. His rifle hung forgotten at his side as he followed the cub deeper into the forest, away from his familiar hunting grounds and into territory he had never explored. Tom had never seen this part of the forest before, despite his decades of experience. The little bear, whom he'd started thinking of as unusually friendly, moved with purpose through the undergrowth. Every few yards, it would stop and look back at Tom, as if making sure he was still following. The trail they followed wasn't marked on any of Tom's maps. It wound between ancient trees that seemed to grow closer together than in other parts of the forest. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy at odd angles, creating patterns he'd never noticed before. The vegetation changed too. Plants he didn't recognize began appearing among the familiar ferns and moss. "This doesn't make sense," Tom muttered to himself, checking his compass. The needle spun erratically, something it had never done before. He pulled out his phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. The rational part of his mind told him to turn back, to return to familiar territory. But the bear cub's confident waddle ahead of him sparked a curiosity he couldn't ignore. The air grew thicker as they ventured deeper into this unknown section of forest. Tom noticed the normal forest sounds. The chirping birds, the rustle of small animals had changed. The noises here were different, almost musical in nature. He couldn't identify any of the calls or songs he heard, despite his extensive knowledge of local wildlife. The cub led him through a narrow passage between two massive boulders. Tom had to turn sideways to squeeze through, his rifle scraping against the rock. As he emerged on the other side, he stepped into a clearing that took his breath away. Flowers he'd never seen before carpeted the ground, blooms in impossible shades of blue and purple that seemed to glow from within. The clearing was perfectly circular, surrounded by trees that must have been centuries old. Their trunks were wider than any he'd seen in this forest, and their bark sparkled with an odd, silvery sheen. The bear cub sat in the center of the clearing, looking rather pleased with itself. It made a series of gentle grunting sounds that almost seemed like speech. Tom found himself responding, "Well, this is something else, little fellow." The words felt natural, as if talking to this bear was the most normal thing in the world. As Tom studied the clearing, he noticed something else. Marks on the trees. Not the usual blazes or trail markers he was familiar with, but intricate patterns that seemed to flow from one tree to the next. They reminded him of writing, though not in any language he recognized. The cub approached one of the marked trees and placed a paw against it. To Tom's amazement, the markings seemed to shimmer and shift. He blinked hard, sure he was seeing things. When he opened his eyes, the cub was watching him with what could only be described as amusement. A rustling in the underbrush caught Tom's attention. He turned, expecting to see a deer or perhaps another bear, but what emerged was a rabbit, except it wasn't like any rabbit he'd ever seen. Its fur had an iridescent quality, shifting colors as it moved, and its eyes held the same intelligent look as the bear cub's. The rabbit hopped to the center of the clearing and seemed to have a conversation with the bear cub through a series of subtle movements and quiet sounds. Tom stood perfectly still, feeling like he was witnessing something he wasn't supposed to see. After what seemed like minutes, both animals turned to look at him. The rabbit twitched its nose and made a chirping sound that reminded Tom of laughter. Then it spoke, not in words, but somehow Tom understood its meaning, clear as day. "The forest has been waiting for you." Tom's grip tightened on his rifle, his knuckles turning white. Everything he knew about the natural world told him this was impossible. Animals didn't talk, trails didn't appear out of nowhere, and compasses didn't just stop working. Yet here he was, standing in a clearing that defied explanation, having a conversation with a rabbit while a bear cub watched. The cub stood up again, ready to continue their journey. It looked at Tom expectantly, and then at his rifle. Tom felt the weight of the weapon in his hands. It suddenly seemed out of place, almost offensive in this magical space. Without fully understanding why, he engaged the safety and slung it over his shoulder. The rabbit nodded approvingly and hopped toward another gap in the trees, one Tom was certain hadn't been there a moment ago. The bear cub followed, and Tom found himself walking after them, leaving the circular clearing behind. As they passed through the new opening, Tom heard what sounded like whispers in the trees, speaking in languages he didn't understand but somehow made him feel welcome. They were heading deeper into unknown territory, and Tom realized he had long passed the point where he could easily find his way back. Strangely, this didn't frighten him as it should have. Instead, he felt an increasing sense of anticipation, as if he was on the verge of discovering something he had been searching for his entire life without knowing it. As Tom followed the bear cub and the iridescent rabbit deeper into the mysterious forest, memories began flooding back. Memories he hadn't thought about in years. The first came like a lightning strike. He was 7 years old, sitting on a fallen log beside his grandfather, learning to whittle a piece of cedar. "The forest is alive, Tommy," his grandfather had said, his weathered hands guiding Tom's small ones with the knife. Not just with animals and plants, but with something older, something deeper. At the time, Tom had dismissed it as another of his grandfather's fairy tales. Now, walking through this impossible place, those words carried new weight. Another memory surfaced. His first hunting trip at age 12. They had tracked a deer for hours, and when they finally had it in their sights, his grandfather had lowered Tom's rifle. A family of fawns had appeared, and his grandfather had whispered, "Sometimes the best hunt ends without a shot fired." Tom had been disappointed then, but his grandfather's smile held a wisdom he was only now beginning to understand. The bear cub stopped at a stream that seemed to flow uphill, another impossibility that Tom's mind struggled to process. As he watched the water defy gravity, more memories crashed over him. His grandfather teaching him the names of plants, showing him which ones could heal and which could harm, teaching him to read tracks, to understand the wind, to move silently through the underbrush. But there had been other lessons too, ones he had forgotten until now. Every creature has a purpose. His grandfather's voice echoed in his head. Even the ones we hunt, especially the ones we hunt. Tom remembered asking why they hunted, if the animals had such important purposes. His grandfather had gone quiet for a long time before answering. "Because that's our purpose too, Tommy. But purpose can change, like the seasons. The trick is knowing when it's time for that change." The bear cub made a soft sound, drawing Tom's attention back to the present. It was watching him with those two intelligent eyes, as if it knew exactly what he was remembering. The rabbit sat nearby, grooming its color-shifting fur, occasionally glancing at Tom with what seemed like approval. Tom's hand brushed against his rifle, and he felt a sudden wave of shame. How many animals had he killed since his grandfather's passing? How many times had he ignored that quiet voice that whispered there might be another way? The weight of 20 years of hunting pressed down on him, each pull of the trigger a betrayal of those early lessons. He remembered the last conversation he'd had with his grandfather, just days before the old man passed. They sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded Tom of the strange flowers he'd seen in the clearing earlier today. "There's magic in these woods, Tommy," his grandfather had said, his voice weak but his eyes bright. "Real magic, not the kind in stories. It shows itself to those who are ready to see it, those who are ready to change." Tom had nodded, humoring what he thought were the ramblings of a dying man. Now, he wondered if his grandfather had known about this place, if he had been trying to prepare Tom for what he would find here. The bear cub suddenly stood on its hind legs, looking remarkably human-like. It pointed with one paw to a path that seemed to shimmer in the strange light. Tom realized they were standing at a crossroads he hadn't noticed before. One path led toward what looked like normal forest, the kind he had known all his life. The other, the one the cub was indicating, led somewhere else entirely, somewhere that seemed to blur at the edges of his vision. Tom felt the weight of choice pressing down on him. His grandfather's final words came back to him, "When the time comes, Tommy, Remember what I taught you first, not last. He had spent years thinking that meant remembering how to track, how to shoot, how to be a hunter. Now he understood. His grandfather had taught him to listen to the forest first. The hunting had come later. The rabbit hopped to the shimmering path and looked back at Tom expectantly. The bear cub waited patiently, its expression almost gentle. Tom felt tears in his eyes as he finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to tell him all those years ago. The forest wasn't just a place to hunt, it was a place of transformation. His hand moved to the rifle strap on his shoulder. Every hunting instinct he'd developed over 20 years told him to keep it close, to stay armed, to be ready. But his grandfather's first lessons, the ones about respect and wonder and magic, told him something else entirely. With trembling fingers, he unshouldered the rifle. For a long moment, he held it in his hands, feeling its familiar weight and shape. This weapon had been an extension of himself for so long that removing it felt like losing a limb. But as he looked at his unlikely companions, a bear cub that showed no fear, a rabbit that glowed like moonlight, he knew what he had to do. Carefully, reverently, he propped the rifle against a nearby tree. As soon as he stepped back from it, he felt lighter, as if he'd set down more than just the weapon. The bear cub made a sound that might have been approval, and the rabbit's fur shimmered with what seemed like joy. Without the rifle's weight on his shoulder, Tom stood straighter, seeing the forest through new eyes, or perhaps through very old ones. The eyes of that 7-year-old boy who had believed in his grandfather's tales of magic in the woods. The path ahead still shimmered with uncertainty, but now that uncertainty felt more like promise than threat. The shimmering path led them to the edge of a lake that shouldn't have existed. Tom had memorized every body of water in these woods, but this one was different. The water was crystal clear, yet he couldn't see the bottom. Instead, light seemed to dance in its depths, like stars reflected in reverse. The bear cub, who Tom now thought of as his guide, bounded ahead to the water's edge. The rabbit followed, its iridescent fur creating ripples of color in the air. As they approached the lake, movement caught Tom's attention. At first, he thought it was just the wind and the trees. But then he saw them, animals, dozens of them, hundreds. Deer emerged from the tree line, moving with a grace that made them seem more like dancers than woodland creatures. Their eyes held the same intelligence he'd seen in the bear cub and rabbit. A family of foxes trotted past him, their fur gleaming with hints of gold that shouldn't have been possible. Raccoons sat in circles, their paws moving in what looked like deliberate gestures, almost like they were having a meeting. Above, the branches filled with birds of species Tom had never seen before. Some had feathers that changed color as they moved. Others seemed to fade in and out of visibility. A group of owls perched on a nearby branch, their heads turning in unison to study him. Unlike the owls he'd encountered while hunting, these seemed to be evaluating him, judging his worth. Tom stood very still, aware that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Without his rifle, he felt vulnerable, yet none of the animals showed any fear or aggression toward him. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something. A large owl, larger than any Tom had seen before, glided down from its perch and landed on a fallen log near the water's edge. Its feathers were a deep, midnight blue with specks of light that really did look like stars. When it opened its beak, Tom wasn't entirely surprised to hear words he could understand. "Welcome, Thomas," the owl said, its voice carrying the wisdom of ages. "I am Eloisa. We have been waiting for someone like you to find us." The owl's eyes seemed to peer into his soul. "Though I must admit, we didn't expect it to be a hunter." Tom felt the weight of every animal's gaze. "I'm not sure what I am anymore," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice seemed to please Eloisa. The owl gestured with one wing, and the animals began to gather closer. "Let me tell you our story," Eloisa said. "For centuries, this lake and the forest around it have been a sanctuary. We are the keepers of old magic, the kind your grandfather spoke of." "Yes," she added, noting Tom's surprise. we knew him well. As Eloisa spoke, other animals began to share their own stories through a combination of sounds, movements, and that strange telepathic understanding Tom was beginning to accept. A deer told of losing her mate to hunters, not for food or necessity, but for sport. A falcon spoke of watching her nesting grounds disappear as humans expanded their territories. A family of wolves shared memories of being driven from their traditional hunting grounds. Yet there was no bitterness in their tales, only a deep sadness and an urgent need to preserve what remained. Tom learned that this sanctuary was one of the last places where the old magic still thrived, where animals could live in harmony with the deeper rhythms of the forest. But our sanctuary is shrinking, Eloisa explained. The human world presses closer every year. The magic that protects this place grows weaker as fewer humans remember or believe in it. She fixed Tom with her penetrating gaze. Your grandfather was one of our allies, though you never knew it. He helped us maintain the boundaries between our world and yours. The bear cub, who Tom now knew was called Benny, pressed against his leg comfortingly. Tom reached down to touch its fur, marveling at how natural it felt now. "Why am I here?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. A chorus of animal voices responded, each adding to the explanation. The sanctuary needed new guardians, they told him. People who could walk between both worlds, who understood both the ways of humans and the magic of the forest. People who had the courage to change. As if to emphasize their point, the lake's surface began to glow. Images formed in the light dancing beneath the water, visions of the forest's past, present, and possible futures. Tom saw the land as it had been centuries ago, teeming with life and magic. He saw the gradual encroachment of human development, the shrinking of wild spaces, and he saw what might come, both the darkness of what could be lost and the hope of what might be preserved. The assembled animals watched him process these visions. Some of the younger ones, fox kits and fawns, played at the water's edge, their innocent joy a stark contrast to the serious nature of the gathering. Tom noticed that even in their play, they moved with a purpose, their games teaching them skills they would need to survive. "We face a choice," Eloisa said, breaking the silence that had fallen. "As do you, Thomas. The path that led you here was not just a physical one. It was a path of transformation, one your grandfather hoped you would find when you were ready." The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the lake. The light caught the animals' fur and feathers in ways that made them seem to glow from within. Tom realized that in all his years of hunting, he had never truly seen the forest's inhabitants until this moment. He had never understood the depth of their intelligence, the complexity of their society, or the magic that ran through every living thing around him. The bear cub looked up at him with those knowing eyes, and Tom felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just a hunter standing before a gathering of animals. He was standing at the threshold of two worlds, being offered a chance to become something else entirely, something his grandfather had always known he could be. Tom spent the next few days living between worlds. During daylight hours, he learned from the animals, each species offering different wisdom. The squirrels taught him about preparation and resourcefulness. The deer showed him how to move silently through the forest, using entirely different techniques than his hunting skills. The wolves demonstrated pack dynamics that went far beyond anything described in biology books. But at night, alone with his thoughts, the battle raged within him. 20 years of hunting wasn't just a hobby he could casually discard. It was his identity. He had a reputation in town as one of the best trackers. His garage contained dozens of trophies. He made good money guiding hunting parties during season. The practical side of his mind kept raising these points, like a lawyer arguing a case. During one restless night, Tom sat by the lake's edge, watching the strange lights dance beneath its surface. Benny waddled over and settled beside him, the bear cub's warm presence now a familiar comfort. "I don't know how to be both things," Tom admitted aloud. "A hunter and a protector." They feel like opposite sides of a coin. He picked up a stone and turned it over in his hands, feeling its smooth surface. Every time I start to accept all this magic, every time I begin to feel at home here, I remember who I am, what I've done. The stone in his hand suddenly felt warm. Looking down, Tom saw it was glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. A memory flashed through his mind, not his own this time, but somehow belonging to the stone itself. He saw centuries of weather, of seasons changing, of animals passing by. The stone had been witness to countless deaths and births, to predator and prey, to the endless cycle of forest life. Everything here is both hunter and hunted, came Eloisa's voice as she glided silently to a branch above him. That is not the choice you face. Then what is? Tom asked, his voice rough with emotion. The choice is whether to hunt with awareness or ignorance, whether to take life only when necessary and with respect for the balance, or to kill for pride and profit alone. The owl's eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. Your grandfather understood this. He was a hunter too, but he was also one of our greatest protectors. Tom's hand instinctively reached for the rifle that wasn't there. The muscle memory was so strong it scared him. How did he do it? How did he balance both sides? Benny made a soft grunting noise and pressed closer. Through their growing connection, Tom received a series of images. Hunters entering the forest, but not just any hunters. He saw those who took more than they needed, who killed for sport rather than sustenance, who had no respect for the balance of life in the forest. Your skills as a hunter are not a curse, Eloisa said. They are tools, like any other. The question is how you choose to use them. A commotion from the forest interrupted their conversation. A young deer burst into the clearing, sides heaving. Through the sanctuary's magic, Tom understood its panicked message. A group of hunters had set up camp nearby. Not just any hunters, poachers. They had already killed several animals and set up illegal traps. Tom felt a surge of anger, but this time it was different from his hunting instincts. This wasn't the familiar excitement of the chase or the anticipation of a kill. This was protective rage, the kind he imagined a father might feel seeing their child threatened. He stood up, body tense with purpose, then hesitated. The conflict that had been raging inside him reached a crescendo. Part of him wanted to rush in and confront the poachers directly. He knew their type, had even guided some of them in the past. But another part of him, the part that was learning the sanctuary's ways, knew that direct confrontation wasn't always the best path. Eloisa watched him struggle, her ancient eyes unblinking. What do you feel, Thomas? Not what do you think, but what do you feel? Tom closed his eyes and let the forest's energy flow through him. He felt the trees, deep, slow awareness. He felt the panic of smaller animals fleeing the poacher's presence. He felt the web of life that connected everything around him and the jarring wrongness of those who would carelessly destroy it. When he opened his eyes again, they held a new clarity. I feel like I finally understand what my grandfather meant about purpose changing like the seasons, he said. I'm still a hunter, but what I'm hunting for has changed. Benny made a sound of approval, and Tom felt the bear cub's pride through their connection. The young deer that had brought the warning stepped closer, no longer showing any fear of the man who, just days ago, might have seen it as prey. I know these woods better than any poacher, Tom said, his voice firm with conviction. I know how they think, how they move, what they look for. He turned to Eloisa. I can use that knowledge to protect this place, can't I? To lead them away from the sanctuary, to make them think this area is empty of game. The owl's feathers ruffled with approval. Now you begin to understand the true balance. The skills of a hunter can serve life as well as death. Tom's internal conflict didn't vanish in that moment. He knew it would take time to fully reconcile his past with his future. But for the first time since entering the sanctuary, he felt his two sides working together instead of fighting each other. His knowledge of hunting could serve a new purpose, protecting those he once would have hunted. As if to confirm his realization, The stone in his hand pulsed one final time before returning to normal. Tom pocketed it, somehow knowing it would serve as a reminder of this moment when doubts crept back in. He looked at the assembled animals, Benny, Eloisa, the deer, and others who had gathered to witness his choice. "Show me what needs to be done," he said. "I'm ready to be both hunter and protector." The warning came at dawn. A flock of crows, their feathers gleaming with unusual blue highlights, arrived in a cacophony of urgent calls. Through the sanctuary's magic, Tom understood their message immediately. A large group of hunters was entering the forest, far more than usual for this time of year. "How many?" Tom asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the glowing stone he now always carried. The crows' collective response painted a grim picture. 12 vehicles had parked at various entry points to the forest. Professional equipment, high-powered rifles, dogs trained for hunting. This wasn't a regular hunting party. This was an organized expedition. Benny, now nearly twice the size he'd been when Tom first met him, growled softly. Through their connection, Tom felt the bear's concern. This many hunters would be difficult to misdirect using their usual methods. Eloisa called an emergency gathering at the lake. As the sanctuary's inhabitants assembled, Tom studied the water's surface, where images of the approaching hunters flickered like troubling dreams. He recognized some of them, professional guides he'd worked with in the past, men who prided themselves on never returning empty-handed. "They're being paid," Tom said grimly, recognizing the signs. "Someone wealthy wants to stock a private game reserve. They'll try to capture young animals alive if they can, kill the adults if they have to." He'd heard of such operations, but had never participated in them. The practice was barely legal and completely unethical. The assembled animals stirred uneasily. A mother deer pressed closer to her fawn. The wolf pack gathered protectively around their younger members. Even the usually stoic elk showed signs of distress. "Our usual defenses won't be enough," Tom continued, his mind racing through options. "They'll have GPS systems, thermal imaging equipment. They'll work in coordinated teams." He looked at Eloisa. "Can the sanctuary's magic hide us?" The owl's feathers ruffled with concern. "The old magic grows weaker each year, Thomas. We can blur their electronics, confuse their devices, but not for long, not against so many." Tom felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Everything he'd learned, both as a hunter and as a protector, would be tested today. He looked at the assembled animals, not just his charges now, but his family. The thought of any of them being captured or killed made his chest tight with anger and fear. "We need to act fast," he said, standing. "They'll split into teams. Try to cover as much ground as possible." He turned to the crows. "Can you track their movements? We need to know which directions they're heading." The crows took flight immediately, their wings catching the early morning light. Tom then addressed the other animals, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew both predator and prey. "Wolves, work with the deer. Show them the hidden paths through the densest parts of the forest, places where humans can't follow." The wolves nodded, their yellow eyes gleaming with intelligence. "Foxes, your dens. The false ones we created. Make them obvious. Let them waste time investigating empty burrows." Each species received specific instructions, playing to their strengths. The beavers would flood certain paths, making them impassable. The raccoons would create distractions, leading the hunting dogs on false trails. Even the smallest animals had roles to play in the sanctuary's defense. "What about the lake?" asked a young otter, its fur shimmering with hints of gold. "They'll be drawn to water sources." Tom looked at the sacred lake, its surface still showing images of the approaching threat. "The lake is our last line of defense," he said. "If they reach it, they'll discover the heart of the sanctuary. We can't let that happen." Benny pressed against Tom's leg, sharing an image through their connection. Tom saw the poachers they'd dealt with weeks earlier, remembered how they'd used the hunter's own expectations against them. A plan began to form in his mind. "Eloisa," he said, turning to the owl, "you said the magic can confuse their electronics. Can it do more?" Can it show them things that aren't there? The owl's eyes gleamed with understanding. The old magic has always worked partly through illusion. Thomas, what did you have in mind? Instead of hiding, Tom said, his voice gaining strength, we show them exactly what they expect to see, but not where they expect to see it. He pulled out his journal, quickly sketching a map. If we can make them think they're seeing signs of animals here and here, he pointed to areas far from the sanctuary. They'll focus their efforts away from us. The animals gathered closer as Tom explained his plan. It was risky. It would require perfect coordination between different species and careful use of the sanctuary's remaining magic. But it was their best chance to protect not just individual animals, but the secret of the sanctuary itself. Just then, the crows returned with urgent news. The hunters had entered the forest and were moving faster than expected. They had already split into teams, just as Tom had predicted, and were spreading out in a systematic search pattern. Tom felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but now it served a different purpose. This wasn't the thrill of the hunt. It was the fierce determination of a protector. He looked at Benny, seeing the same resolution in the young bear's eyes. This is what we've prepared for, he told the assembled animals. Everything we've learned, everything we've built, it all comes down to today. He touched the glowing stone in his pocket, feeling its warmth spread through him like courage. Let's show them that this forest protects its own. The animals dispersed with purpose, each knowing their role in the complex defense they were about to orchestrate. As Tom watched them go, Elisa landed on a branch beside him. Your grandfather faced a similar test, she said softly, though not quite on this scale. Tom squared his shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. Then let's hope I learned his lessons well enough to pass it to. The forest became a battlefield of illusion and strategy. Tom's plan unfolded like a complex dance, with each animal playing its part perfectly. The crows maintained a constant stream of intelligence about the hunters' movements, while the sanctuary's magic worked to confuse their equipment. Tom recognized the lead hunter immediately through the crows' reports. Mike Brennan, a man he'd guided on several hunts in the past. Brennan was skilled, ruthless, and worst of all, smart. He wouldn't be easily fooled by simple tricks. They're splitting up exactly as we thought, Tom muttered to Benny as they watched from a hidden vantage point. Through the bear's eyes, he could see the heat signatures of the hunting parties, an ability that still amazed him. 3 teams were heading north, following the false trails they'd created. 2 more were sweeping east, investigating the empty fox dens. But Brennan's team was different. He's not buying it, Tom realized, watching Brennan's methodical movement. He's heading straight for the lake. Eloisa glided silently to their position. The magic weakens, she warned. We cannot maintain all the illusions much longer. Tom made a quick decision. Focus the magic on hiding the lake. We'll handle the hunters. He looked at Benny, who had grown into a formidable young bear over the past months. Ready for some real protection work, partner. The bear's response was a mixture of excitement and determination. They'd trained for this, practicing ways to deter hunters without causing harm. Tom touched the glowing stone in his pocket, feeling its warmth spread through him, connecting him more deeply to the forest's magic. They moved silently through the trees, positioning themselves between Brennan's team and the lake. Tom could hear the hunters' voices now, their confident tones carrying through the forest. The tracks are different here, Brennan was saying. Something's been working to hide them. Something smart. Tom felt a chill. Brennan had always been too perceptive for his own good. Through his connection with Benny, he could sense other animals moving into position. Wolves flanking the hunting party. Foxes ready to create distractions. Even the smallest creatures prepared to play their parts. Boss, one of Brennan's men called out. The GPS is acting up again. Screens all scrambled. Because we're getting close to something, Brennan replied. Something worth hiding. They were less than half a mile from the lake now. Tom could feel its magic pulsing behind him, could sense Eloisa and the other magical creatures working to maintain the illusions that protected it. But the strain was showing. Patches of the forest's true nature were beginning to peek through. Tom made his decision. Touching the stone once more, he stepped out into a clearing, directly in Brennan's path. Behind him, Benny remained hidden, ready to act if needed. "Hello, Mike," Tom said calmly. Brennan's rifle came up instinctively, then lowered slightly when he recognized Tom. Well, Tom Walker. Heard you'd gone soft. Started turning hunters away from these parts." His eyes narrowed. "Now I'm starting to understand why. The forest's changed, Mike. Or maybe I have." Tom kept his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "Either way, you need to turn back. There's nothing here for you." Brennan's laugh was cold. "Nothing here. Our client's paying top dollar because he knows this area's special, unique specimens," he said. "Animals that shouldn't exist." He raised his rifle again, not quite pointing it at Tom. "Move aside, Tom. I'd hate to have to explain to folks in town why I had to shoot you." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Tom felt Benny's anger through their connection, forced himself to project calm back to his friend. "You're right about one thing," he said. "This place is special, but not in the way you think." As if on cue, the forest around them began to change. The sanctuary's magic, guided by Eloisa and focused by Tom's stone, created a display like nothing the hunters had ever seen. Trees seemed to shift and move. Shadows took on impossible shapes. The very air shimmered with power. Brennan's men began to shift nervously, but their leader stood firm. "Tricks and special effects won't scare me off, Tom. I've come too far." "No tricks, Mike. Just truth." Tom spread his arms, and as he did, Benny emerged from the forest behind him. But not just Benny. Wolves flanked them on both sides, their fur shimmering with otherworldly light. Birds with impossible plumage filled the branches above. Even the small creatures, mice and rabbits, emerged to stand boldly before the hunters. The sight was magnificent and terrifying. Most of Brennan's men took involuntary steps backward, their rifles wavering. But Brennan himself remained focused, his rifle now aimed directly at Benny. "Exotic specimens indeed," he whispered, a hungry light in his eyes. "Our client will pay double for these." "They're not specimens, Mike. They're guardians, just like me." Tom took a step forward, placing himself directly in the rifle's path. "And if you want them, you'll have to go through me first." The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled taut. Tom could feel the sanctuary's magic swirling around them, could sense every animal holding its breath. Through his connection with Benny, he could feel the bear's muscles tensed, ready to act if needed. Brennan's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't be a fool, Tom. Step aside." "I already was a fool, Mike. For years, not anymore." Tom stood his ground, the glowing stone in his pocket pulsing like a second heartbeat. "This is your last chance to walk away." The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the confrontation would break. Everything Tom had learned, everything he had become, focused down to this single moment of choice. Not just his choice, but Brennan's too. Time seemed to freeze in the forest clearing. Tom stood unwavering before Brennan's rifle, aware of every breath, every heartbeat. Behind him, he could feel Benny's presence, strong and steady. The stone in his pocket pulsed with increasing warmth, and suddenly Tom understood what he needed to do. "Let me tell you a story, Mike," Tom said, his voice carrying an authority that made even Brennan pause. "About my grandfather, and about what this forest really is." Without lowering his rifle, Brennan's eyes narrowed. "This isn't story time, Tom. You remember my grandfather, don't you, old Jack Walker?" Tom took a careful step forward. "Remember how he always seemed to know where the animals would be, how sometimes he'd lead hunting parties in circles for days, then claim the game had just moved on." A flicker of recognition crossed Brennan's face. Through their connection, Tom felt Benny's understanding of his strategy. The bear remained perfectly still, but Tom could sense him communicating with the other animals, preparing them. He wasn't losing his touch in those later years, Mike. He was protecting something. Something your client probably suspects exists, but doesn't truly understand. Tom reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew the glowing stone. Its light had grown stronger, casting strange shadows through the clearing. Brennan's men muttered among themselves as the stone's light pulsed in rhythm with the forest's heartbeat. Even their dogs had gone quiet, sitting calmly instead of straining at their leashes. "Look around you, Mike. Really look." Tom held the stone higher, and its light spread through the clearing. The sanctuary's magic, rather than hiding, now revealed itself fully. The trees seemed to breathe. The ground beneath their feet thrummed with ancient power. Even the air sparkled with tiny points of light. This forest isn't just trees and animals. It's one of the last places where the old magic still lives. The kind of magic that keeps the world in balance. Tom's voice carried memories of his grandfather's teachings, but now he understood them in a way he never had before. Your client probably saw signs of it. Unusual animal behavior, strange lights, compass needles that spin for no reason. But what he's looking for can't be captured or sold. Brennan's rifle wavered slightly. "You expect me to believe in fairy tales, Tom. I expect you to believe your own eyes." Tom gestured to the animals gathered around them. "Look at them, Mike. Really look. These aren't just ordinary creatures. They're guardians of something precious. Something that belongs to all of us." The light from the stone grew brighter, and with it, the true nature of the sanctuary's inhabitants became clear. The wolf's fur rippled with starlight. The bird's feathers shimmered with impossible colors. And Benny, standing proud beside Tom, seemed to glow with an inner fire that marked him as far more than just a bear. Brennan's men began lowering their rifles, their faces showing a mixture of awe and fear. But Brennan himself remained unmoved, his rifle still trained on Tom's chest. "Even if I believe you," Brennan said, "do you think our client will care? Do you know how much money rare specimens are worth?" "I know exactly how much," Tom replied, "but I also know the cost of destroying something irreplaceable." He took another step forward, the stone's light growing stronger. "Think about your son, Mike, the one who loves those nature documentaries. What will you tell him when the last of the world's magic is gone, when all that's left are concrete walls and caged animals?" The mention of his son hit home. Tom saw the first real crack in Brennan's determination. Through their connection, Benny shared a memory. A young boy visiting the forest with Brennan years ago, his eyes wide with wonder at every bird and squirrel. "There's another way," Tom continued. "The sanctuary doesn't have to be a secret we keep from everyone. It can be something we protect together, something we preserve for our children and their children." The stone pulsed one final time, and the clearing filled with gentle light. Images appeared in the air around them, visions of the forest's past and possible futures. Tom saw his grandfather as a young man, making the same choice he faced now. He saw generations of guardians, both human and animal, working together to protect this sacred place. "Your client sees dollar signs," Tom said softly, "but what we have here is priceless. It's hope, Mike. Hope that we haven't completely lost our connection to the natural world. Hope that there's still magic left, if we're wise enough to protect it." Brennan's rifle lowered fractionally. "If I walk away," he said slowly, "what's to stop someone else from coming? Other hunters, other clients?" "Nothing," Tom admitted, "except us, the guardians, human and animal together." He held out his hand, the glowing stone resting in his palm. "You could be one of us, Mike. You and your son both. This place needs protectors who understand both worlds, who know how hunters think, how they track, how they can be guided away from what must be preserved." The rifle lowered another inch. In the branches above, Eliosa watched silently, her ancient eyes taking in every detail of this crucial moment. The other animals remained still, understanding that this was a turning point, not just for Tom and Brennan, but for the sanctuary itself. "Your grandfather," Brennan said finally. "He tried to tell me something like this once. Years ago, I thought he was going senile. He was trying to show you what he showed me, Tom replied. That being a hunter doesn't mean you can't also be a protector. That sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when not to take the shot. The rifle barrel pointed at the ground now, though Brennan's finger remained near the trigger. Prove it, he said. Prove this isn't just some elaborate trick. Tom smiled and reached out his other hand to Benny. Together, they took a step toward Brennan, the stone's light growing warmer, more inviting. That's exactly what I planned to do. What happened next would be told and retold among the sanctuary's inhabitants for generations to come. As Tom and Benny approached Brennan, the stone's light spread outward in gentle waves, touching everything in the clearing. Where it passed, the veil between ordinary reality and the sanctuary's magic grew thin. Brennan's eyes widened as he saw the forest as it truly was for the first time. Trees that had seemed ordinary now pulsed within a light, their ancient memories visible as shifting patterns beneath their bark. The air itself came alive with tiny motes of light, like earthbound stars dancing between the branches. My God, Brennan whispered, his rifle forgotten at his side. Behind him, his men stood transfixed, watching as animals they had planned to capture or kill revealed their true nature. The wolf's fur rippled with starlight. The bird's feathers painted impossible colors in the air as they flew, and even the smallest creatures glowed with inner fire. But it was Benny who captured everyone's attention. The young bear, who had started this journey by distracting Tom from a kill, now stood as a true guardian of the sanctuary. His fur shimmered with patterns that looked like constellations, and his eyes held wisdom far beyond that of an ordinary bear. This is what your client was sensing, Tom explained, his voice gentle. Not just rare animals, but the last traces of old magic, the kind that keeps the world in balance. He held out the glowing stone. Would you like to understand it better? Brennan hesitated only a moment before reaching out. As his fingers touched the stone, his face transformed with wonder. Through the stone's power, he could feel what Tom felt, the web of life connecting everything in the forest, the ancient awareness of the trees, the songs of birds that carried more than just sound. My boy, Brennan said softly, he needs to see this, to know it exists. He can, Tom replied. But first, we need to make a choice, all of us. He looked at Brennan's men, who were still standing in awe of their surroundings. This place needs protectors who understand both worlds, people who know how hunters think, how to guide them away without confrontation, people who can help preserve what's left of the magic. One of Brennan's men, a younger hunter named Steve, stepped forward. My grandfather used to tell stories, he said hesitantly, about places in the forest where compasses wouldn't work, where animals seemed smarter than they should be. I always thought they were just stories. The stories were true, Eloisa said, gliding down to land on a branch at eye level. The hunters jumped at hearing human speech from an owl, but the magic flowing through the clearing helped them accept it. They were warnings and invitations to those who could understand them. Through his connection with Benny, Tom felt a new possibility emerging. He saw the sanctuary not just as a place to be hidden and defended, but as a seed of hope that could spread, not by revealing all its secrets at once, but by carefully choosing allies who could help protect the remaining magic in the world. Your client, Tom said to Brennan, he's not the first to sense something special here, and he won't be the last. But instead of selling him specimens, what if we offered him something more valuable? Knowledge, understanding, a chance to be part of preserving something miraculous. Brennan looked at the stone in his hand, then at his men, and finally at his rifle lying forgotten on the forest floor. Like what you're offering us, Tom nodded. The sanctuary needs a network of protectors, people in town who can guide hunters away from sensitive areas, people who can teach others about respect for the forest, people who can help identify those who might be ready to learn about the deeper magic. As he spoke, Tom felt the approval of the sanctuary's magical inhabitants. Eloisa's feathers glowed softly, and the ancient elk emerged from the shadows, its antlers crowned with living light. Even the smallest creatures seemed to shine brighter, affirming the rightness of this new path. "It won't be easy," Tom continued. "Some people won't understand. They'll need to be guided away gently, without ever knowing what they're being guided from. Others might be ready for small glimpses of the truth. The rarest few will be ready for what you've seen today." Brennan handed the stone back to Tom, his face set with new purpose. "My son," he said, "he has your grandfather's gift. He sees things in the forest that I never could, until today." He straightened his shoulders. "I want him to grow up knowing this is real, knowing there's still magic in the world." One by one, Brennan's men stepped forward, drawn not just by the magic they'd witnessed, but by the chance to be part of something larger than themselves. Each touched the stone, each felt the connection to the forest's deep magic, and each made their choice. When the last hunter had stepped back, Tom felt a shift in the sanctuary's energy. The magic that had been weakening over the years felt stronger, renewed by this bridge between worlds. Through his connection with Benny, he sensed approval from the deepest parts of the forest. "So," Tom said, looking at the group of former hunters, who were now becoming something new, "shall we begin your first lesson in being guardians?" The sun broke through the canopy, casting dappled light across the clearing. Where the light touched, the magic sparkled more brightly, as if the forest itself was celebrating this turning point. Benny pressed against Tom's leg, sharing images of the future, of new guardians learning the sanctuary's ways, of children growing up knowing the magic was real, of the ancient power growing stronger rather than fading away. Tom put his hand on Benny's head, feeling the warmth of their connection and the truth of his grandfather's words. Purpose changes like the seasons. What had started as a simple hunting trip had led to transformation, not just for Tom, but for everyone touched by the sanctuary's magic. As they began walking toward the lake, where Eloisa would begin teaching the new guardians about their roles, Tom knew that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The sanctuary would face new challenges, but it would face them with new strength, new allies, and renewed hope for the future. In his pocket, the stone pulsed warmly, like a heart beating in time with the forest's ancient rhythm, as if to say, this is how magic survives in the modern world, not by hiding, but by finding those ready to protect it, one heart at a time.